Why didn't they just fly eagles into the mountain and drop off the mountain?
Well,
There's a logical explanation, right?
yeah. Well, if you read the Silmarillion, you get some more answers related to that.
I'm not going to read it, but tell me so I don't have to. Wake up, sleeper, and welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. My name is Dr. Hai Kurlopian, and today we're going to talk about all things Middle Earth with expert Dr. Marcus Shera, who's also a new assistant professor at Eastern University. Today, we discuss the deep theology woven into the Lord of the Rings franchise and how it offers practical wisdom for us all today. We'll talk about the brilliant mind behind it all, J.R.R. Tolkien, his story as an orphan, his devoted faith, and how this entire universe began as a side quest telling bedtime stories to his kids. From there, we'll unpack some of his more powerful theological ideas, like the phrase eucatastrophe, the song of creation, and the notion of subcreation. Of course, we'll also spend some time with the beloved characters and themes such as fellowship, faith, and the corrupting nature of power as we take a closer look in this narrative that has touched so many hearts across multiple generations. But before we jump in today's conversation, I do want to read our Bible verse of the week, which comes from Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and enjoy this Christ-centered conversation. All right, Marcus, welcome back to the Christ and Coffee podcast.
Thank you. Hi, glad to be here.
So good to see you. I do recall that we watched a Hobbit when you were in youth group.
Right, all the way back 2012, it came out, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right, about 12 years ago plus. And now we're going to nerd up on Lord of the Rings and the theology of Lord of the Rings. But you did bring an interesting book there. What is that?
Oh, yeah, this is a book I ordered 3, 4, maybe 5, 6 years ago, actually, from Armenia. This is an Armenian copy of the book Hobbit.
Hobbit, so that's how you say Hobbit in Armenian.
That's how you'd say The Hobbit in Armenian. And it's if for anyone that knows how to read it, it's Armenian lettering, but almost in a style of script that looks like the Dwarvish letters, Khuzdul letters.
Which is interesting, because I always think Armenians are like dwarves because of Mount Ararat, them being a diasporan people in exile, and having big noses, hairy beards, and very stubborn, always fight each other, and they're jewelers. So it's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's so cool, man. And like Tolkien was someone who like invented languages. He wasn't your normal dude. He literally created own languages at an early age.
Yeah, you'd say the discipline he was in was philology, or like the love of words or the love of languages. So just kind of naturally he understood that the development of languages and the development of peoples and cultures are very closely related to one another, you know? So he would kind of draw them up from scratch, and in a sense all of the worlds that he built along the way and the fiction that he ended up developing is almost like a side project or an outgrowth of his study of language.
Yeah, so the heart of that, and let's learn more about him. He had a quite unique upbringing. I just learned a little bit about it, but if you could know some more, did he grow up in South Africa, or
he was born there? I don't think he lived there very long. He probably moved when he was something like 5 years old. But his father was a sort of adventuring businessman, and had some business opportunity there. Moved there. He was born there, and things like that.
And then like the dad tragically dies, and then his mom dies when he was like 12 or something.
Yeah, so 12, I think something like 14. And that's when they had moved back to England. And at that point, his mother had converted to Catholicism. He was a Catholic. And so him and I believe his brother were then adopted by a Catholic priest that they were friends with. And not formally adopted, but they were put under the care of a Catholic priest.
That's amazing. And this Catholicism has been very strong throughout his whole life.
Yeah, he's known to be a robust traditional Catholic all the way up until his death.
Like wants to do the mass in Latin and appreciate the Catholic faith, because this is foundational to not just the fantasy genre of Lord of the Rings, but the Lord of the Rings impact on all fantasy genre and sci-fi genre moving forward. Because I don't think people understand how this sets the stage for so much world building and so many of the arts that people appreciate today. And it starts with this kind of orphan kid who's a teenager in England,
Yeah, and he's not just. It sets up the stage in the sense that he's not just building a novel. He's not just writing a novel, and he doesn't want to just tell one single story. He's pulling, in a sense, a story out of a whole mythology. So the fact that the languages come first is really important because it sets up the sense of there's a whole organic world here, and then he only writes stories in that world that make sense in that world, that are consistent with the whole organic growth of it. And so all of the big, like, deep dive lore, huge universes, Star Wars, Star Trek, Game of Thrones, all of these things are really set. The stage is set for them by someone like Tolkien. He's sort of giving them an example of how to do something like that.
And Tolkien's like pulling on like experiences from this world, the world we live in, and all good fantasy and sci-fi takes from what's already existing and kind of like pivoting it, and because it creates a familiar yet nuanceness. And let's talk a little bit more about his life. So he was in World War I, right?
Yeah. He fought, he would have been 17 or 18 when he went into the war. He was famously in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the most like horrific battles in all of World War I. And at least one of his very good childhood friends also died in the battle.
Yeah, that's wild. And because I mean, when you see the war scenes in Lord of the Rings, like he actually lived through one of the worst things imaginable, trench warfare, where most people in that battle died. I think he got freed because he got sick, and otherwise he would have died. Like,
and specifically, World War I is associated with these really horrific weapons or methods of war that had never been tried before, and you see some of that in Lord of the Rings too, with specifically Saruman's troops, that they have these new machinery that's never been used in warfare before, and so the old style Rohirrim, who are just have traditional horses and knights and stuff like that, are shocked by explosions and crossbows and all of these things.
Yeah. It's wild. And then he right before he goes to war, he marries his like high school sweetheart, pretty much.
Basically, yeah.
And then he survives the war, comes back, and because he's so brilliant and smart, he just becomes like an Oxford professor.
Basically. Yeah.
And then, so he's just a professor.
Yeah. And at Oxford, he, tying into his Catholicism, this is still a time where Catholics are not exactly allowed into the highest classes of English society. So in the Oxford professor hall or dining hall or something like that, he had to sit at a separate table along with the Jews, right? So there was a table for Catholics and Jews, kind of people that are not exactly in with the rest of the Oxford crowd, whereas his friend C.S. Lewis would have been allowed to sit on those other tables.
That's hysterical and sad at the same time. Yeah. It's really sad, actually. It's messed up. It's like the 1900s. It's wild. And then Lord of the Rings emerges. He gets married, has a good job, has kids, and then he starts off writing The Hobbit first, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, his whole life, even the earliest thing he wrote that kind of became part of this mythos was a story called Beren and Luthien that was about him and his wife, or it was notionally about him and his wife, and on their tombstones it says Beren and Luthien.
Okay, so that's just direct connection.
Yes, yeah, and he wrote that maybe in 1918, like right after the war or something like that.
So he was a romantic at heart then. He really,
in some ways, not necessarily like the 19th century romantics, but he was in love with his wife. Yeah,
that's great, and they had a great marriage till the end. Four kids, and he seemed like a very supportive and loving dad. And out of his love for his kids, he wrote The Hobbit, right?
Right. In that the story goes that he would tell them bedtime stories, like just making stuff up like a dad would, like trying to get the kids to go to sleep. And then eventually they start to notice, like, oh, well, last week you said Bilbo did this, but this time you said like he's wearing a different color thing. And so he started to get frustrated with it as, someone who's cares about consistency, and then goes and writes things down, and eventually it becomes an outline of a book.
So out of the love for his kids, he blesses all these children with one of the best-selling kids books, The Hobbit. And it's in Armenian. And then from there, it gets like more teenagery after the sequels, because Lord of the Rings is more like a little more adult,
right? Because
PG 14 or 13 versus PG. Would that be the distinction between the two? Or
the Lord of the Rings, they get you really get in more rougher situations and things like that. But even The Hobbit, he wasn't going to publish it. He didn't plan to publish it. Just I don't know if C.S. Lewis just saw it or picked it up one day and was like, "You got to publish this, dude. Like this is really good."
So like the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is a side quest for him, because he's like
exactly.
His main job is a professor of like linguistics, and translating Beowulf, right?
Yeah, that he was an Anglo-Saxon literature guy, basically.
Got it. And he had this group with C.S. Lewis and a bunch of other literature guys. What were they called?
The Inklings.
And they would like meet at a pub and they would discuss.
The pub called the Eagle and Child. It almost went out of business recently, a few years ago. But then Ian McKellen, who played Gandalf in the movies, bought it so that it didn't go out of business.
Okay, he was like, "You shall not close down." Okay,
yeah, exactly.
That's hysterical. Wow. And I love like the fellowship of his life too, with the fact that he was a family guy, cared about his kids, and had like the greatest literary minds in English literature, like a weekly hangout, or
Yeah.
and they just collaborated and worked on
Yeah.
it together. And it's cool to think about the Lord of the Rings kind of being like his own little world he created, but in a sense of like for the sake of his children and also in collaboration with these other great minds who got to proofread
Yeah.
and whatnot. And then it led to this thing he's known for. And after his death, there's movies about it, and most people got revisited through the movies, and then and realizing how many people he's inspired. Like we said, all different world building philosophies emerged. The whole fantasy genre, I would say, stems from
Yes.
his own.
I mean, there's fantasy before Tolkien, but Tolkien really sets, in a sense, the archetypes that are used by many other people. And
he's also like borrowing from like his studies of mythology, Norse mythology, this and that. So he's actually kind of an expert of the tradition and pivoting into a new direction.
Yes. Yeah. No. So the Hobbit, when he comes out with that, I think it's something like 36 or something like that, and it becomes very popular, and they start to translate it into a bunch of languages. There's this funny story, I think, that I found in the letters or something like that, where they are going to translate it into German during the Nazi regime, right? So this is before the war, but after the Nazis take over, and they're going to translate it into German, and they start to send him letters, this German publisher, like trying to interrogate his background, saying like, oh, are you Jewish or something like that? That's what they're trying to insinuate. And he basically goes like, no, I am not Jewish, but I would be proud to be if I was, or something like that.
Wow. There's so much to unpack right there, but it's quite remarkable. And then let's now talk about Lord of the Rings then.
Yeah.
So the theology of Lord of the Rings, most theologians would start about understanding, like the Christian theology of this world, and the truth of it with creation. Mm-hmm. So what's the creation story of Lord of the Rings?
Well, the creation story, how the world comes to be, is not something that you get in the pages of Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, right? You get it in this other later published work called The Silmarillion, which is, in a sense, throughout his whole life, he was working on this is his real masterpiece. But it was such a bizarre book. It was something that no one had published a book like that at the time, because it reads almost like a made-up mythology of a fantasy world, right? It ended up getting published after his death, and so this is where we actually have the details of how he understands the entire world's generation and the history of the elves and their languages and how they develop and things like that.
So did he create this first, or kind of like this was like background notes to everything he was working on?
Yeah, and he created it first, and he initially wanted to publish it. So The Hobbit comes out, it's popular. Then the publisher says we should do something else. And so he goes, okay, well, I have this whole masterpiece grand book that I've created, and here's an explanation of it. And the publisher goes, what is this? That doesn't make any sense. So just write a sequel. So that's how he gets Lord of the Rings.
But then he like uses that as like the textbook to build characters.
Yeah, in a sense.
Make character-driven stories within these parameters.
Right.
And so this world called Middle Earth.
And so things that show up in the Silmarillion, these other angels or gods, or they're called Valar in his work, are referred to, or historical stories like the story of Beren and Luthien is referred to by Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, but you don't really get a sense of exactly what it is. So from the Hobbit's perspective, in a sense, in Lord of the Rings, you're hearing Aragorn talk about these grand stories, and there's this sense of wonder that you get in Lord of the Rings about this huge world that I know nothing about. And the Silmarillion is like when you're finally getting into those ancient tomes and you're able to understand the background of all of this stuff.
Got it. So there's like this world building that's already really determined and fine-tuned, and there's this whole mythology of like it's called the Song of Creation, right?
Or the first book, I don't know exactly how it's translated. He would know how it's because
he just makes up stuff. Yeah.
He would know how it's translated. But the first part of the Silmarillion is called the Ainulindale, and it's basically a very simple story that if you're familiar with basically a Christian understanding of the beginning of the world is pretty familiar. In that he basically says God wanted to create a world, and he created first these angels or other beings, he created for them a symphony that he wanted them to sing, right? And it was a beautiful symphony. It was the most beautiful symphony ever. And so what he does is he has this symphony in 3 parts. And he first presents them the first symphony, and they sing it for him, and it's incredibly beautiful. And then they start the second symphony, and one of the Ainur, or you can think of them like angels, one of the angels who is the best singer, who has some of the greatest ideas, is the most intellectual, or has the best understanding, he thinks, of the world things. Well, actually, my understanding of this symphony is even greater than God's, right? So I'm going to start to introduce my own sort of rhythms or my own melodies into this. And as he starts to do so, it corrupts the other angels around him who are listening to this, like, oh, maybe I'm actually going to join Melkor's.
The guy's name's Melkor.
The guy's name is Melkor, yeah.
It's like a Pride Before the Fall.
Right, yeah. And so it becomes really, really tense in this moment because, is this one angel going to destroy this great work of God's? And then God says the second symphony is done, and then introduces a third symphony, which in a sense completely negates all of the work that Melkor did destroying the second symphony, right? And so then what God does is he presents then to the angels, he says, what you did, the song that you just sang, is sort of a preface to this other thing which I will create, right? Which is the created world, Arda, he calls it, right? So, and then he sort of presents this to them and he says, what you're going to do now is I'm going to send some of you down onto this world and you're going to be in charge of fashioning certain parts of this world into something as beautiful as the song that you just sang. And he says, Melkor's not allowed to do it, because you messed up. But Melkor doesn't listen, and he sends all of these other gods down. You can think of them like archangels that are supposed to be responsible for the airs or the rivers or the trees, right? And then Melkor says, you know what, I want to go down there and mess my own stuff up too, right? So Melkor starts to corrupt some of the things as they're beginning to fashion the world.
So there's this foundational thing about like a creation and corruption.
Right.
And the Melkor is a corrupted like angel or right. whatever they're called. And then you have like the bad villains of. So the setting of let's talk about the setting. The setting is Middle Earth, which is called Arda.
Yeah, well, Middle Earth is just a part of Arda.
Okay, so there's the globe, and then the story takes place in Middle Earth. And then you have like on the cosmic level this fallen angel, and then the main villains of Lord of the Rings are corrupted
lower angels, yeah. So some of God sends all these other various angels down and they're in charge of fashioning the world in various ways. And then Melkor says, my project is a little bit better than God's project. I'm super smart. I'm trying to create this other thing. Look at what I did. Isn't that impressive? And so he starts to attract other figures over. And these are the figures that are more familiar to you in Lord of the Rings, like someone like Sauron, right?
And Sauron's who? Just some lower angel?
So yeah, Sauron's one of the other lower angels who works for one of those archangels, and he's in charge of craftsmanship in many ways. So he is sort of, in a sense, wooed by, and maybe his pride is inflamed by Melkor. Melkor says, oh, you're working on that project that God and his archangels are in charge of. It's not that good. Mine is much better. I can use your ring crafting skills for this other purpose, or I can use your skills as a craftsman for these other greater purposes. We don't need to listen to them anymore.
So in many ways, like the whole thing could be summarized as like, all right, there's this creator thing that created the song, and then there are like a few people like, I don't want to sing that song, I want to sing my own song.
Right.
And is that kind of like a narrative thread throughout? Like, all right, the good guys sing the good song, and then the people who want to wield the power, the ring, they want to make up their own song, create their own world.
Right, yeah, and this term that he uses that's associated with him is subcreation.
Okay.
Right? And I remember talking to our friend Damon Farashettian about subcreation when I first heard about it, when I was in high school and reading about this stuff. And essentially the idea is that God creates the world, right? But then he tasks, his angels in this case, but then further on us and his other created creatures with creating within that world, creating with respect to his larger plan. So you do have a freedom. There is something, there's some part of that plan that is actually generated from you in the sense that you're an image of God. Right? But you don't get to violate his order. You don't get to deviate from the bounds that he sets for you. So someone who takes that, they say, I'm generating part of this order. I'm actually responsible. The credit of this beauty should go to me, right? They might say, why do I need to listen to these constraints that God set up for me? Why can't I go beyond them, right?
Okay, so this subcreation is this term of having dominion and your responsibility that you're created for.
Right. And then domination, he uses this other term, domination, to mean someone who takes that power that they have to create and transgresses beyond where God wants them to initially use that power.
And then the villains do exactly that.
Right.
And the ring of power is like a weapon to utilize to kind of subjugate others, to go out
particularly dominate others' wills. Yeah,
and like mind control, right? That's like the ring of power, the whole thing of the rings. Can you explain the rings? Because that's kind of confusing.
The rings come much later in the narrative from these early stories, but basically it's
that's where Lord of the Rings starts, right? Like there's like a quick summation in the beginning.
Yeah. That's where Sauron creates these various rings. He actually there's a whole series of events that happens. He causes all these other messes, and then he disguises himself as another more beautiful creature called Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. And then he goes around, he crafts these various rings for the various races, 9 rings for men, 7 for dwarves, and then he is working in concert with these other elves who create the 3 rings for the elves. And then he delivers these rings to people, which give them power in their domains. They make these human kings very powerful. They make these dwarven kings very powerful. But the ring that he actually creates in secret controls those other rings. Right. Yeah. So he ends up having domination over their wills because they were seduced by the power that the rings that he gave them affords them.
And this is another big theological theme, the idea of free will and the choice of love versus dominance or selfish power.
Right.
Being so crucial. I mean, even the word fellowship implies this kind of Christian community. The word fellowship is koinonia. It's like the word for church. It's a word for loving God and loving others. It's like the essential thing. And from The Hobbit, you have the 12 dwarves, like they're the disciples of Christ on this mission and journey. And then another missional moment with the 9 people, the Fellowship of the Ring, on the quest to kind of defeat this ring of power, right?
Yeah, and well, let me tell you one story, though, about, I think it's my favorite story that sort of is a preface of what the Fellowship ends up doing and the direction they end up going with things, is very early on, before even the elves and humans are introduced into the world, one of those archangels, in fact, the one that Sauron himself is responsible for working with, is named Aule, and he's the archangel responsible for taking care of the mountains and the things underneath the earth and things like that, right? And so he starts to get impatient because he wants these various creatures to observe his crafts. So he wants to create beautiful gems and things like that underneath the mountain. And then he wants these creatures who can observe those and appreciate them with him, right? But God had set one particular boundary in creation. He said, you are not allowed to create creatures with souls, in a sense, with other living creatures which are going to observe and work with the things that we create, right? Be sub-creators themselves. So what Aule does, though, is he creates in secret underneath the mountain a race of people who grow up under the mountain and are there to appreciate these things, right? And so he does it under the mountain thinking God can't see him, kind of like an Adam and Eve in the garden, hiding themselves even though God can actually see them, right? And then God basically says, I can see what you're doing. You're doing this thing I told you not to do. You have to stop. You have to destroy these people that you've created, right? And so Aule sort of submits to God and says, okay, you're right. I'll have to do that. He holds up his hammer to destroy them, and then God stays his hand, almost like an Abraham and Isaac kind of moment, right? And so what he ends up doing, and God says, what you've done is actually beautiful. What you've created is beautiful, but you've gone beyond the boundaries of what I asked you to do, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these people to sleep, and then I'm going to create separately the men and the elves, and then these creatures can grow up into their own race that is going to appreciate the things that you've done. So Aule's transgression, or Aule's sin, this is kind of like the second symphony, Aule thinking that he can create something better than what God's original plan was. And then since Aule has the chance to repent and turn back towards God, right, and turn back towards what he wanted, and he loved God's commandments more than he loved his own sin, right, God actually gave him back that world, and that new world, that third symphony, is sort of informed then by the thing that he did. So Aule's sin or Aule's transgression was turned into or converted into something greater, some more beautiful picture. Right.
Okay.
And this theme also is what develops further on in the story as we go forward.
So something bad turned good.
Right. So just the fact that Melkor can exist and that Melkor can mess up God's creation because he was given free will doesn't mean that God can't take those events and then turn them into something even greater, despite the sins and transgressions.
So what did those creatures become?
Those basically become the dwarves.
The dwarves.
Yeah. So the men and the elves are called, or rather the elves and the men are called the first and second born children of Iluvatar, or God, and then the dwarves are called the adopted children of Iluvatar. Right?
Okay. And then what about the hobbits?
The hobbits actually are men, but they're just men in some very bizarre branch of the genetic tree or something like that. So they're just really short guys, basically.
With hairy feet.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Great. And then there's this Fellowship of the Ring. Want anything to add, John? Or there's this Fellowship of the Ring. You have 4 of those hobbits, 1 dwarf, 1 elf, 2 humans, and then Gandalf was like this angel.
Yeah, Gandalf himself is a spirit in the similar class of angels as Sauron.
So he's pretty up there.
Yeah.
And what's the like? So there's this big thing about Tolkien, unlike C.S. Lewis didn't like an allegory. Like there was no like Jesus figure, right? There's like one of these guys that was not Aslan, like is the Jesus figure, but
Right.
there were Christ-like elements in some of the people, the key people of the good guys.
Yeah, there's no single Christ character in Lord of the Rings per se, right? But several of the individuals are doing things that are Christ-like, right? Or they are prefiguring aspects of Christ, right? And so, for example, Aragorn takes on this Return of the King kind of role. It's the name of the third book. And so he's like the fact that Christ is king, or
Promise King, the Return of the King, like
yeah.
okay.
And Gandalf is this sort of figure with great power and wisdom who goes to the various kings of Middle Earth and challenges them out on their faults, right? So Gandalf is like a prophet in this sense, and Christ has this prophetic role in his time as well, right? And then Frodo is the one who, since he takes on the ring and is the one that's willing to take on the sacrifice himself and bring it to the volcano, right, Mount Doom, to destroy it where it was created, is analogous to Christ, being the high priest, right, and taking on this sacrifice for everyone else, right? So all of these different characters are performing actions that are Christ-like, but none of them is the Christ for all of humanity, right? None of them actually is able to perform that full incarnational role that Christ plays.
He's like, there's no like Neo from the Matrix. There's no, no Aslan. It's just like these priestly, prophet, kingly roles that are personified.
Yeah.
And what makes all these guys great is they're willing to sacrifice, take those great leaps, and there's a lot of heroic moments throughout the whole narrative of like we're gonna just fight and trust that we're gonna distract the bad guys and just trust that Frodo is gonna drop the ring. Like there's always these like crazy levels of faith and trust and altruism throughout the fighting, right?
Yeah. So faith is a huge part of it in the sense that many of the actions that they take, they do on the fact or on the belief that they have that God is going to give them the right thing at the right time. And so they feel that they can walk a very straight and narrow path. They don't feel the need to supplement themselves with technology or the ways of the world or these various other things. Now, not every character entirely walks the straight and narrow path, but the fact that they believe that this will work is in large part due to their faith in Eru, Iluvatar, or God, which he doesn't really come up too much by name in the actual Lord of the Rings narrative.
Yeah, and that's because it seems like a dumb suicide mission, trusting this like midget, hairy feet kid with, all right, this is the most powerful weapon. Just take care of it for us, right?
Yeah.
Like there's like a level of absurdity and faith there, right?
Yeah, and there's plenty of characters along the way that lose faith, right? So the most famous is Boromir, right? Who is
Sean Penn, who always dies in his movies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's not exactly a prince of Gondor.
Sean Penn?
Yeah.
Sean Bean.
Sean Bean, yeah,
Sean
Bean,
Penn
exactly.
I was like, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, Sean Bean, who's also in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Who, well, I'm not going to mention that.
Well, we can talk about it. It's like, because Game of Thrones is like the anti-narrative of this.
Right, no, I mean, I don't want to give spoilers for what happens to Sean Bean in Game of Thrones.
I think people
watching
know
by
this
are...
Okay, people know by this. This is a very spoiler-heavy conversation.
Yeah. But Boromir he's not a prince of Gondor, but what he is he's a noble son in this very important position where there is no king of Gondor right now, right? So him and his family have been entrusted to take care of Gondor until the king returns. And so Boromir, when he's tasked to be a part of the fellowship, he says, okay, I'm going to go along with this because this seems like what everyone's doing, but I'm a little bit suspicious. Why are we trusting a hobbit? I didn't even know that hobbits existed barely before I came here to Rivendell. So I don't really trust this plan exactly, but I'm going to go along with it because it seems like whatever else is doing, right? But slowly he starts to lose faith in their ability to cohere as a unit, especially after Gandalf dies, right? He starts to believe that this fellowship has now lost their mission, has lost their leader. He doesn't trust Aragorn as a leader, so he's going to take the ring for himself from Frodo. So he corners him at this one moment, and basically Frodo himself ends up succumbing and putting the ring on in order to escape. But Boromir sort of thinks of the ring as this thing where, well, if I take it, then I can use it in battle, right?
Yeah.
I can use the power of the ring in battle to defeat Sauron. Not like this weird, stupid plan that you came up with where like a little guy like crawls in a hole and then like goes in a thing. Like, how's that ever going to work, you know?
Right. So he represents the lack of faith in this crazy plan.
Right. And his lack of faith is evidenced by his desire to use power, right?
Yeah.
So when you lack faith in God, you all of a sudden become desperate for power because you now realize that you have a gap, that you have an insufficiency that you need to cover with something else.
Yeah. Was he ever familiar with Nietzsche's work, like The Will to Power?
I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Nietzsche precedes him, so
Yeah. So then it's like this concept of like, I'm going to create my own ethic. I'm going to create my own, I'm going to become Superman. I'm going to win on my terms.
Nietzsche was also a philologist, right? In that they were in the same academic discipline. Nietzsche kind of went crazy at various points and didn't exactly have a normal life.
Yeah.
But they were both in the same discipline in that they were ensconced in the origins of languages and how the development of languages and development of ideas came together. So actually, now that you mention it, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he was familiar with Nietzsche.
Yeah, I'm very interesting too. Is like his dad died when he was young. Was a Lutheran priest, and yeah, I mean I don't. Yeah, I mean he influenced the Third Reich. Like I don't care what people say. Yeah, he was anti-Semitic. Yeah, but he influenced people to take matters into their own hands and there's this will to power aspect, which kind of is like liberating and exciting. It's like I make my own future, I make my own destiny. But like Tolkien is kind of against that. He's like, no, you got to submit to the order. You got to do your purpose. You got to have faith and love for other people. You got to take these heroic actions, and it's kind of quite the opposite.
Yeah, and so holding your faith in something outside yourself, whereas Nietzsche is all about once God is dead, you put it back on yourself, and now you are responsible for everything in your life, which leads you to these desperate grabs for power or hatred of others, or throwing anyone out of your path that might get in that very narrow, direct way that you're trying to achieve your local goals.
Wow. And the Ring of Power doesn't like symbolize like the nuclear bomb or anything. It's just
some people alluded to that, and Tolkien said, "Well, it's not like I was thinking of the nuclear bomb when that happened, but I see why people say that." Right? In that the nuclear power, the ability to split an atom, it allows you to create energy to degrees that we've never been able to do before, but also it allows you to create the most destructive weapon mankind's ever created. Right?
Yeah. But he just wanted to tell a good story within the world he created and kind of like follow the narrative traction and kind of rely on these themes of like fellowship and trust and love and altruism and to kind of have this kind of concept of God's providence triumphing over evil. Didn't he coin a term that talked about this concept of like what was intended for evil will be used for good?
Yeah, the term that he creates is catastrophe, EU, and then the word catastrophe.
So right? United Nations, not EU.
Yeah, not European Union. More like euphoria, or something like that, right? Or EU means good, or in Greek as a Greek root.
So a good catastrophe,
right? Or a catastrophe from which something good comes, right? So
this is like a theological concept because
right. So the cross, the events on the cross, God as a human should not be killed. You should not be going around trying to kill God, right? But in fact, that is what happens in the Christian faith, right? But out of Christ's death, he tramples on death, right? Or he goes through and by those events and his subsequent resurrection, the world is saved and a pathway is open towards eternal life, right, through those events. So you would never think like the optimal plan in order to give everyone eternal life is to have God die. You wouldn't think that's part of it.
Right.
But in fact, the moment in which it seems like the plan is completely over, right, the moment in which all hope should be lost, something can be turned out of it, right? So sometimes Tolkien used to say about the world, he didn't have a sense that the world was going to get more progressively better for people, right? Like I'm an economist, so we're always going, look at how much GDP has increased in the last 200 years. And that's true. And that's amazing, right? But that is not something that you ought to put your faith in, because he used this other term, the long defeat. We're in the long defeat. But since he had this faith that out of catastrophe, something good could come, he knew that at the end of that, something great could be transformed, right?
And how is that played out in the narrative of the Lord of the Rings?
Right. So for those of you who have seen the movie, right towards the end, right, Frodo, who is struggling the whole way to not succumb to the temptations of the ring, or not succumb to using the ring to make his burden lighter, right, in various ways. Right at the end, he succumbs to the temptation and he puts the ring on, and at this moment, they're wrestling with, and they get attacked by the creature Gollum, who we haven't really mentioned. But the creature Gollum, who also is addicted to the power of the ring, more for his own pleasure instead of for political power. He's almost like, some people say that Gollum is one of the first greatest images of someone that's an addict in literature.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems like all hope is lost because Frodo, this one person that was going to be able to bring the ring to the final moment, is now succumbed to its power, and he wants to take it for himself. But through this wrestling with Gollum, Gollum ends up biting off his finger. So Gollum bites off Frodo's finger that has the ring on it, takes the ring for himself, and then falls into the volcano. And when the ring goes down, Gollum dies, and the ring is destroyed, and Sauron's power is lost.
So it was like a pleasant accident.
Right. Yeah. But so some people even note that in that moment, there's a sort of Gollum is tripped by an unexplainable reason, and this is almost pointed out as one of the only times where God directly intervenes in the Lord of the Rings story by causing Gollum just to trip in that one moment. Right. And it's unexplainable by other terms. Right.
Interesting. Is that in the text?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not in the movie. And
I think there's something like it in the movie. I haven't watched enough carefully to notice, but I don't think they get rid of that per se.
Let's talk about Gollum then, because
Yeah.
that's a fascinating character. You're saying that he's like one of the first literary addicts to power. What does he represent? The fall of humanity, the corruption of power, the kind of the repercussions of power gone wrong, or
right. So Gollum, before he is attracted to the ring, is of the same sort of type of person as the other hobbits, right? He's from this other group that lives in another area. He doesn't live in the Shire, but he's very similar to the hobbits. They have common ancestry, right? So
just like we have common ancestry to Andy Sarkis.
Yes, yeah, who plays Hobbit in the movies,
Armenian, okay.
or who plays Gollum in the movies, yeah.
So he has common ancestry to the Hobbit,
right? And so if Frodo or if Bilbo had gone full bore on, I'm just keeping the ring for myself, they would have probably turned into something like the creature Gollum, right? So Boromir wants the ring because he has these political ambitions, because he wants to be a great and powerful ruler over Gondor, right? Whereas many people, they don't have political ambitions, right? So I can think of myself as, I don't want to be president, or I don't sit around imagining myself being president. Sometimes I do, actually. But
we can talk about that later. Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Most people just want basically normal lives, and they think, oh, well, if I just had it a little bit easier, or if I didn't have to do that one thing that I know that people tell me I'm supposed to do, right? This is a much, much more common temptation, right?
So the ring of power kind of is like a temptation thing, and everyone's temptation strings are different. So Gollum just wants indulgence.
Yeah.
Boromir wants political power to save his kingdom.
Yeah. So the fact that Gollum is one of the bad guys sort of kicks away an interpretation of the ring that what Tolkien is saying is, oh, well, political power is bad, right? He's not just saying political power is bad. The same thing that makes a politician tempted to control others is present in all of us, right? And the fact that I want just a little bit more pleasure and I'm willing to ignore or push other people away is just as bad and perhaps just as destructive on the whole as one bad king, right?
And each of the characters have different ambitions. What's like with there's what's the other, the White Wizard?
Saruman,
What's his temptation with the ring?
Yeah, Saruman is very interesting because him and Gandalf, the reason that they're in Middle-earth is because they were tasked to prevent Sauron from rising again, right?
Okay, they're like guardian angels, gone, and one goes for bad.
In a sense, yeah. And Saruman is the captain of them. He's Saruman the White is the name of the position for the wizard that's in charge of that council, right? And so what he starts to notice is he has this is a very interesting theme that we can talk more about too. He has this ball called the Palantir,
and see into the future and stuff, or see in the present.
What it is it allows you to communicate with other people, right? So anyone else who has one of these balls, you can sort of deliver messages to them or something like that, right? And so when he finds that he has one of these, he starts looking into it and digging deeper into it, trying to find knowledge, trying to see what's happening in other parts of the world. And in fact, Sauron has one of these as well, right? So Saruman actually begins communicating with Sauron, right? His supposed enemy, the person he's trying to stop. And Sauron starts sending Saruman these various messages, even some true things like, oh, look how big my army is getting, you know? And these things, these half-truths, basically start to scare Saruman into a position where he goes, we can't beat Sauron, so we have to join him, right?
So it gives into the fear of...
Right, so Sauron is able to use these images or communications to scare Saruman into thinking, well, we can't go with that strategy of destroying the ring anymore, so I'm going to have to take it for myself. And maybe I can then betray Sauron after that. But he goes on his own completely different pathway of trying to to achieve this supposed goal, he thinks he's getting rid of evil, but actually he's becoming the same thing he's trying to destroy.
So he's trying to like the ends justify the means sort of thing.
Right,
He think he's like gonna kill the bad guy, but join him first.
Right.
And it's okay to be bad for a little while. So
Yeah.
he's more of like a nuanced character than
Yes,
kind of like
exactly.
the movies show. Because like the ball is kind of in the extra credit scene, the extended edition.
Yes, yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. So,
Yeah.
and this goes back to the power corruption thing.
Yes,
right.
yeah.
It's never good.
But also, I noticed this recently, is that the network of Palantirs, all of these various communication with all different parts of the globe, you think you're accessing great information through something like this. But the fact that it's giving you all of these half-truths or not the complete picture or other people who have malicious intentions.
So it's like the internet.
It's like the internet is exactly right. And so, oh yeah, this is great. We can communicate with anyone all over the globe like instantly. That's fantastic. But the fact that one person who wants to twist your mind in one small way is also on there, you have to watch out. The other character in the narrative that has a Palantir is Denethor, who's Boromir's father. Right. So what Sauron does to Denethor is he starts to send him all these images.
He's like the most hated guy in the movie.
Everybody
Rightfully
hates
so.
him. Yeah.
Okay.
He starts sending him these images like, oh, this is my army coming, and they're going to completely destroy you. Right. And he shows him these images. Denethor has complete despair and basically commits suicide. Right. And so giving someone else despair is one way to destroy them, or he destroys Denethor's hope and makes Gondor weaker in that moment, such that they can't resist Sauron effectively.
And the virtues of the fellowship is this like relentless hope in hopeless situations, this faith, this acts of love. Like the Christian virtues is kind of celebrated, like just great storytelling. We want to celebrate the virtuous heroes. Yeah. And it's quite remarkable how he's able to do that with all these nuances and whatnot. Pretty amazing stuff. Why didn't they just fly eagles into the mountain and drop off the mountain? Well, there's a logical explanation, right?
Yeah, well, if you read the Silmarillion, you get some more answers related to that.
I'm not going to read it, but tell me so I don't have to.
Well, the eagles are not, because people talk about that option as if...
What's the name of the pub?
The Eagle and Child.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's related per se, but
there's like a child on an eagle at the end of the movie. Okay, anyway.
Yeah. But so people talk about this thing because sometimes they see Gandalf, like, it just gets rescued by this eagle. So they think, oh, well, the eagles are on the good guy team, right? So can't they just tell the eagles to do whatever they want? And the eagles are actually a very unique set of characters because the eagles are, in a sense, emissaries of Manwë, who is one of the Valar, one of those archangels who's responsible for the skies. He's kind of like the Zeus, if you will, of the Valar, right? And he sits on top of a mountain and observes everything that's happening. So he's observing, Manwë is observing everything that's happening during the Lord of the Rings, right? And Gandalf is actually, when he was more of a spirit before he was given a human form, was a servant directly of Manwë. That's why Gandalf has this special relationship with the eagles. Right? And so when the eagles come in, these are to be thought of as moments in which Manwë is intervening in the story. So the question of why don't the eagles come in and just save them is almost equivalent to the theological question of the problem of evil. Why doesn't God just come in and just like fix all the bad stuff right now? And if he doesn't, then maybe he doesn't exist, right? The eagles are an analogous thing because Gandalf, no one in the story, the eagles are not a technology. They're a gift in a sense from God in these moments in which he's taking care of you. So the fact that they have so much faith that by the end, the eagles are going to save them is evidence that their faith was justified.
Wow. I was not expecting that theological answer.
Well, yeah, but people need to actually read the books instead of just making stories up on the internet.
Is there like parallels with World War II? I know he fought in World War I, like the two towers being like Japan and Germany, and then the Eagles, maybe American fighter jets coming in at the end of the war. Like,
well, ironically, he saw his son actually fought in World War II. His son was in the RAF, right? He was a fighter pilot for the UK. I'm not sure if he was a fighter pilot or not, but he was a pilot in the RAF for the UK. And so there's a few letters that Tolkien has between himself and his son. And one of the things that he says in one of those letters is he analogizes the new, because, air forces, air warfare was new at the time. And he analogizes the fighter planes to the Nazgul birds, he calls them, or those creatures which the Nazgul ride, like they look like disgusting dragons or something like that.
Those are bad guys. Okay.
Yeah, he thought of these technologies, these vicious technologies, as analogous to the strange creatures that the evil ones created. So all of these bad creatures, the trolls, the dragons, all of the stuff like that is in the Silmarillion are these other creatures created by Melkor. So when God tasks all of the archangels of creating various parts of the world, Melkor goes, I'm going to make something even cooler and better. So he makes all the bad, evil, ugly creatures, right? And depending on which interpretation you have, the orcs are created to be this negative image of the elves. The the trolls are created to be this negative image of the ents. And then the dragons or the fell beasts, perhaps negative images of the eagles in some way, right? So when thinking about World War II, Tolkien saw all of these technologies on both the Allies and Axis side, and he thought of both sides as taking the ring a little bit. And of course, it's the Allies that end up developing the nuclear weapons and using them, right?
Wow.
That's not to say that the Allies were just as bad or something like that, but that's to say that many people do get in these positions where they really feel that they have to transgress what they thought was a moral constraint on them yesterday in order to achieve a goal against what is supposedly a greater evil, but can turn you into Saruman.
That's amazing. The constant theme of the ends don't justify the means.
Yeah, and he gave this very strange speech in the '60s where he was invited by one of the early. I mean, Lord of the Rings was one of the first books that had like fan clubs and stuff like that, right? So he's invited in the '60s, like 20 years after the books comes out, to this fan club group in the Netherlands, and they say, "How can you apply these books, to the world today?" And he says. He talks like poetically, like just in normal conversation. He says like, I look north, south, east, and west, and I do not see any Saurons, but I see Sarumans all around me, right? Meaning I don't see anybody who just is out and saying, I want to be king of the world.
Pure evil.
Hitler is maybe more analogous to a Sauron, right? But you see many people who go, oh, well, I want this greater good, but I can't have it right now. So I'm going to justify whatever means I can use to get there, right? And so he saw that all around him with various things. I don't know in the 60s particularly who he's talking about, but he saw that Saruman character is much more common to his day and to our day, I think, than the Sauron character, the guy who just wants to be the proud bully.
Yeah, this is great because I'm realizing how nuanced the good and evil is here because it's the corruption of good or the absence of good or it's like a very it's more of a Christian understanding of the complexities of the line of good and evil is drawn between humankind, and then the ring of power bringing out the choice of choosing corruption and not obedience, or knowing your dominion and serving as you're supposed to, sing that song of creation, going back to that third act of creation, which is kind of quite remarkable. Wow. And then he wrapped up kind of with a nice bow, and Lord of the Rings, is that the end? Is there anything after that? Or
well, there's one thing that he wrote. He ended up not writing any sequels or anything like that. I mean, there's plenty more that he wrote that was never published until after his death, right?
And his son,
that his son was basically a curator of. Even a few years ago, they're still coming out with new things that he wrote that had never been published before, right? But he did have one draft chapter basically that's available in his extended works called, I think, The Return of the Shadow, I think is the name of it, in which he's speculating like this is how another novel would begin. He never ends up finishing it, but it's basically set like 100 years after the end of Lord of the Rings in Gondor, and there's these little boys basically who they had heard about the War of the Ring. They know about the events. They know about these stories, but they don't know. They never experienced it themselves. So they don't have any experience of evil. They've been told about evil, but they don't have any really experience of evil. So they start just playing around, right? And they're like, I want to be an orc, I want to just go around and mess stuff up, right? And so the character that's really referred to in that chapter is something like, a guy who is in his old age. He was a young soldier at the time of the Lord of the Rings, and he's looking back and he's going, I don't know where we're going next, right? Because all of these great figures, Aragorn passed away. Aragorn's son, I believe, is a king at the time, and he doesn't know where the world is going next. So
is it like you think it's like a reflection on the hippies of his day, kind of like the beginning of the New Age movement?
I don't know if the hippies
like he's like, why are you dabbling in these old pagan practices?
Yeah,
maybe okay.
To some degree, but also anyone who just is sort of dismissive of this notion that evil is something to take seriously, and that these constraints on your behavior are something that you can transgress sort of willy-nilly because they have no consequences. Right?
Wow, fascinating. Final question: can you explain how Gandalf comes back?
God does it. So that's another God moment in the Lord of the Rings text, in that Gandalf was sent over with Saruman to prevent Sauron from coming back to power, right? But when Saruman clearly, even though he was supposed to lead this mission, when Saruman sort of goes astray and doesn't focus on the mission properly, Gandalf sort of takes up the mantle in a sense, and he was Gandalf the Grey at the end, but then when he's sent back, he's Gandalf the White.
So he takes on the role of the other guy?
He takes on the mantle of Saruman, yeah. So when he's Gandalf the White, in a sense, he's granted more power, or he's really, maybe you should think of it as, he's granted the license to have more power by Manwë and by Eru Iluvatar, the god, right? And so he is put back in that position that Saruman was supposed to be in. And so he takes up that mantle, and he takes up the responsibility and leads the people of Middle-earth in a constrained, proper, righteous way, not the pathway that Saruman went down.
Like a true prophet. Okay, wow. Okay, so that just kind of brushed over in the movies, kind of, he just comes back.
Well, they don't really explain how he comes back, but he does, right? They don't really contradict this sort of narrative at all, but the book is also very unclear. The Lord of the Rings itself is.
Yeah.
But in the larger story, you start to really realize and understand this stuff. And Tolkien really filled all this out in the rest of his writings.
What was your favorite part of the story?
Well, I always used to tell people that The Two Towers was my favorite book, just because I like the nitty-gritty, and I like the fact that they're scattered, and then they all realize that they have their own private missions. So at the end of the first book, you have the breaking of the Fellowship, and it seems like each one of them should think, well, we should lose faith because we don't know where Frodo is, we don't know where the ring is, right? But then each one of them in their own location notices a local goal that they ought to solve, right? So if you're finding yourself in a moment where you think that some grand story that you were part of is all of a sudden done, well, wherever you are, if you continue that same faith, you're going to find a local story that you fix. So Merry and Pippin end up bringing the Ents back into the battle, and they end up blocking Saruman in a serious way. I forget what they call themselves. The three hunters, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. They go and basically find Gandalf, and then they rescue the country of Rohan, and then they end up serving all these greater goals, right? So they never lose hope in those moments, and then wherever they find themselves in the more complicated, specific parts of the world, they have the same faith, and it's reflected this greater whole, that they have the faith in that moment, and they solve a local problem, which build up to solving a global problem.
That's well put, and that's a good way to look at life and trust. Going back to the providence thing and the God creating and taking evil situations and redeeming it.
Yeah.
For everyone within the church to kind of fight your local battle.
Yeah.
And let God bring it all together at the end.
Yes. Yeah.
And let him trip Gollum.
Yeah.
And send some eagles.
Yeah. You don't want God to go tripping people per se, but something like that.
Got it. Any favorite quotes? Because he was a poet at heart.
Well, I was actually thinking about this earlier today. I'm not really the quotes guy.
You're more like the big picture.
I like the narratives and the systems and the economies of it all, right?
Yeah.
But one that's pretty famous is that all that is gold does not glitter. All those who wander are not lost. I messed that up. But you get the spirit of it, right? And that someone like Gandalf, one of the nicknames he has is the Grey Pilgrim or the Grey Wanderer. Right? And so he seems like a guy who's wandering, but really the whole time he's gathering information and putting together a larger picture such that he can, in the right moment, say, oh, this is where the ring is. We need to deal with this right now because Sauron's coming back, right? And so he's a guy who is criticized by Saruman. So you think, like, does Gandalf have any faults? Well, Saruman would point out Gandalf's faults all the time. He says, you're always spending all his time with those hobbits, right? What is the point of spending time with hobbits? We've got a big, like, universal goal that we need to solve here, right? And to some degree, that's true. Gandalf sort of distracts himself a lot of times, and he doesn't notice that Saruman is going down the wrong path. But his time spent with the hobbits turns out to be very fruitful because he realizes that it's among the hobbits that you have the humility, and also in plot terms is where the ring is, right? Such that you can actually bring it and destroy it, right? So sometimes I think like I'm like a little bit wandery in terms of like I have very unstructured days, and which is a problem, right? In that I end up wasting a ton of time, right? Gandalf wastes a ton of time, but I end up pulling things together, and I realize, oh, I wasn't lost. I was actually doing something that whole time, right? That's kind of the way I think. So
that's well put. And it goes back to this whole providence theme, and the third song of creation going back, and that phrase. I mean, he made up this amazing theological term.
Yeah.
How do you say it?
Eucatastrophe.
Eucatastrophe. Yeah, and I think I can't think of a better way to, like, that's how our story ends. There's this, death is not the end.
Yeah.
There's a new creation, and in many ways the song is still being sung right now, and there's some people singing it off key right now, and then one day it's going to be completely brought all together.
Yeah, and so it's a great vision of what you're having faith in, right? In a song which is corrected, right, or a misharmonies which are woven into something greater, right?
Yeah.
So you don't deny those misharmonies, you don't deny the missteps or the sins, but you have faith that God is going to pull them into something better.
Amen to that, brother. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the end of this very nerdtacular Christ and Coffee episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. If you have any comments, questions, please comment them below. If you have a favorite part or something we missed that needed to be discussed, please put it in the comment section below. Thank you for tuning in to the end of this podcast. Remember, my friends, stay caffeinated and God bless you.